rain was coming down in sheets, thunder cracking through the night sky. He almost didn't stop, just a stray dog, shivering in the storm. But something in those eyes, something desperate. He couldn't turn away. He had no idea that decision would change everything, because the next morning, a fleet of military vehicles was waiting outside his house. Tom had seen stray dogs before, living on the outskirts of town. It wasn't uncommon, but this one was different. He wasn't just wet and cold. He was terrified, like he'd seen things no animal should ever have to see. Tom had no clue what he was getting into when he carried that dog inside, wrapped him in a blanket, and whispered, "You're safe now." But was he? Because by sunrise, Tom's peaceful home had turned into something out of a movie. Black SUVs, armed soldiers, and a knock on the door that made his stomach drop. Tom had never been the type to ignore an animal in distress. It wasn't just kindness, it was instinct. Some people saw a stray dog and kept driving. Some people assumed it wasn't their problem. But Tom, he wasn't wired that way. So when he saw the dog, a muddy, soaking wet German shepherd curled up on the side of the road, he pulled over without a second thought. The storm had been relentless. Heavy raindrops pounded against the truck's windshield, and flashes of lightning split the sky in half. The wind howled through the trees, like something out of a horror movie, bending branches until they looked ready to snap. It was the kind of night where no living thing should have been outside, and yet there he was. Tom barely spotted him at first, just a dark shape against the drenched asphalt. The dog was curled up near a ditch, half hidden by the tall grass. His fur was matted with mud, his body rigid. Tom put the truck in park and stepped out, instantly hit with the freezing rain. His boots sank into the muddy roadside as he crouched down, his heart already sinking. "Hey, buddy." Tom's voice was soft, careful. "You lost." At the sound of his voice, the dog flinched, not like a startled pet, but like an animal expecting to be struck. His muscles tensed as he lifted his head, and in that brief moment, their eyes met. And that's when Tom knew. This wasn't just a stray. There was something in those eyes, something calculating, something trained. Most stray dogs either cowered in fear or wagged their tails in desperate hope for food. But this one, he was studying Tom, measuring him. Tom slowly extended his hand, palm up, the universal sign of peace. The dog didn't move at first. The rain pounded harder, soaking through Tom's jacket. His knees were already covered in mud, but he didn't care. He just held his hand there, steady, waiting. The dog's breathing was shallow, visible puffs in the cold air. His ribs were slightly visible beneath his wet fur. He wasn't in terrible shape, but he had definitely missed a few meals. Then, after what felt like forever, the dog shifted. Just slightly. His muscles stayed tight, but he took one cautious step forward, then another. Tom barely breathed. When the dog got close enough, Tom saw it, the faint scar along his ear. A clean, precise line. Surgical, not a fight wound, not an accident. This dog had been operated on. Tom's stomach twisted, but he kept his voice calm. "That's it, buddy. You're all right. Let's get you out of this rain." Carefully, he reached forward. The dog stiffened, but he didn't bolt. Slowly, Tom placed a gentle hand on his back. The dog was ice cold, his fur drenched. He had to be miserable. Tom knew the next few seconds were critical. One wrong move, and this dog could bite, run, or worse, shut down completely. But then, with a sigh so quiet Tom barely heard it, the dog leaned in. Just a fraction. That was all Tom needed. He scooped the dog into his arms, gritting his teeth at the weight. This wasn't some tiny stray. He was solid, muscular, heavier than he looked, even exhausted. He had power. Tom hurried back to the truck, opening the passenger door. "All right, bud. Up you go." The dog hesitated for half a second, then jumped in. Tom climbed into the driver's seat, dripping wet, and cranked up the heat. The dog sat rigid, his ears flicking with every sound. The rain, the windshield wipers, the distant rumble of thunder. Tom watched him out of the corner of his eye. "You look like you've been through hell, buddy." The dog didn't respond. Of course not. But something in his eyes said, "You have no idea." By the time Tom pulled into his driveway, the storm had settled into a steady downpour. His house was quiet, warm, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The dog hesitated at the threshold, his body tensed again, like stepping inside a house was something foreign. Tom knelt beside him. "You're safe," he said softly. "Promise." After a long pause, the dog stepped inside. Tom grabbed an old towel and knelt down, gently rubbing the water from the dog's fur. At first, the dog flinched at the contact, but after a few minutes, he let out a quiet sigh and leaned into the towel. "That's more like it," Tom murmured. The scratches on the dog's body weren't deep, but they told a story. He'd been through something rough. Tom grabbed some leftover chicken from the fridge and set it down. He expected the dog to devour it, but he didn't. Instead, he ate slowly, calculated bites. No lunging, no desperation. Tom frowned. Most strays would tear into food like it was their last meal. But this dog, he was disciplined. More questions, more things that didn't add up. As the fire crackled in the background, Tom sat on the couch, watching the dog. "Who are you?" he whispered. The dog lay on the rug, his ears twitching slightly. He didn't answer, but Tom had a feeling the answer was coming, and he wasn't ready for it. Tom wasn't a morning person, never had been. So when a heavy knock rattled his front door at the crack of dawn, his first instinct was to ignore it. But the dog was ready. Before Tom even sat up, the German Shepherd had bolted to the door, standing at full alert. His body was rigid, ears pricked forward, tail stiff, not like a pet waiting for their owner, like a soldier waiting for orders. Tom's stomach dropped. The knock came again, harder, more urgent. Tom pulled on a hoodie and stumbled toward the door, glancing outside through the window. His blood went cold. A row of black SUVs lined his driveway. Not police cars, not delivery trucks, military vehicles. Tom's pulse pounded. What the hell was going on? A third knock, this time accompanied by a voice. "Sir, we need to speak with you now." Tom swallowed hard and glanced back at the dog. He hadn't moved. He was still staring at the door, muscles coiled like he was ready for a fight. Something about this felt wrong. He took a deep breath, then unlocked the door. And the moment he did, everything changed. Standing on his porch was a man in full military uniform. Expression unreadable, voice firm. "Mr. Walker," the officer said. "We need to talk." Tom's heart hammered. About the dog. Tom woke up to a deep, rumbling sound. At first, he thought it was thunder. The storm from last night had been brutal. Lightning cracking across the sky, winds howling through the trees. Maybe it was just another passing front, but then he heard it again. A low, steady vibration that wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from the ground. His chest tightened. Something was off. Throwing the blankets aside, he stumbled toward the window, rubbing his face as he pulled the curtains open. And that's when his stomach knotted. Outside, his driveway was no longer empty. A convoy of military vehicles lined the gravel road leading up to his house. Black SUVs, a transport truck, and, most unsettling of all, armed soldiers standing in formation beside the vehicles, their expressions unreadable. Tom's heart thudded against his ribs. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. Behind him, a sudden movement caught his attention. The dog, no Shadow, who had been peacefully sleeping by the fireplace just minutes ago, was no longer curled up on the rug. He was ready, ears perked, body rigid, eyes locked onto the front door like he already knew what was coming. Tom's pulse pounded in his ears. The knock came next. Loud, firm, unyielding. Tom glanced at Shadow. The dog didn't move, but his muscles were coiled like a spring. Tail held low in a way that wasn't fear, just control. Tom swallowed hard, his gut screaming at him. This wasn't a friendly visit. He hesitated before unlocking the door, every instinct telling him to brace himself. As the door creaked open, the first thing he saw was the badge, a gleaming, polished insignia pinned to the chest of a man in a crisp military uniform. The officer stood tall, shoulders squared, his expression cold and unreadable. Behind him, more men in uniform loomed near the vehicles, their postures stiff, waiting. The air felt different, charged. The officer's voice was steady, clipped. "Sir, we need to talk about the dog." Tom's grip tightened on the doorframe. His mind raced. How did they find him? How did they even know he had the dog? His eyes flicked to Shadow, now standing at his side. The dog hadn't growled, hadn't barked, but his presence alone was enough to command attention. His gaze was locked onto the men outside watching. Tom's voice came out hoarse. "What about him?" The officer's jaw twitched slightly. "That's not just a dog." A pause. "Then, that's a classified asset." Tom blinked. His mouth went dry. "What?" The officer nodded toward the German Shepherd, whose tail remained low, but whose eyes never wavered from the uniformed men. "His name is Shadow. He's a military working dog, and he's been missing for weeks." Tom could hear the words, could process them, but something in his brain refused to connect the dots. Missing, classified. He turned, looking at Shadow, the scar on his ear, the disciplined posture, the way he never fully relaxed, even when he seemed at ease. Tom exhaled slowly. "Okay," he said carefully. "Let's say I believe you. Why does that mean you're at my house at 6 in the morning with a damn convoy? The officer's expression remained unreadable, because Shadow wasn't just lost, he said. He was taken. Tom's mind reeled. Taken. He turned fully to face Shadow now, studying him like he was seeing the dog for the first time. The scar, the careful way he moved, the discipline in his posture. Pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even realized he was solving started clicking into place. Tom faced the officer again, crossing his arms. You're gonna have to give me more than that. A flicker of something crossed the man's face. Annoyance? Hesitation? Then, finally, Shadow was part of an elite K-9 unit assigned to a classified military operation. He went missing 3 weeks ago under suspicious circumstances. The way he said it, suspicious circumstances, sent a chill up Tom's spine. Shadow wasn't just some lost working dog. He was a piece of something much bigger. Tom exhaled sharply. All right, say I believe you. What do you want from me? The officer didn't hesitate. We need the dog back. Silence. Tom felt his stomach twist. Something about the way the officer said it didn't sit right. The words were straightforward, but there was an edge to them. A pressure. Okay, Tom said, voice slow. If he's yours, then fine. But if you think I'm just handing him over without any explanation, the officer cut him off. This isn't a request, Mr. Walker. And that's when Shadow moved. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't aggressive, but the shift was felt. Shadow stepped forward, his body perfectly still, but his presence suddenly commanding. His eyes locked onto the officer, unwavering, and for the first time, Tom saw something unexpected. The officer hesitated, just for a second, a flicker of uncertainty, a beat too long, and that's when Tom knew there was more to this, more than a lost military dog, more than a simple retrieval mission. Shadow wasn't just an asset, he was a threat. The air between them was tense. Tom knew he had two choices. He could step aside, let them take the dog, and go back to his life like none of this ever happened. Or he could trust the feeling gnawing at his gut, the feeling that something was very, very wrong. He looked down at Shadow. Shadow looked back, and in that moment the choice was made. Sorry, Tom said, straightening, but he stays with me until I get some answers. The officer's expression hardened. This isn't your fight, Mr. Walker, he warned. Tom's jaw clenched. It is now. A long silence stretched between them. Then, the officer exhaled. Stepping back, he motioned to one of the men by the SUVs, who pulled out a phone. Tom's chest tightened as the man spoke into the receiver, his voice low. Then, after a beat, the soldier turned back to the officer and nodded. The officer's eyes locked onto Tom's. We'll be in touch, he said. Then, without another word, he turned, motioning for the others to follow. Tom watched as the soldiers climbed back into their vehicles, watched as the convoy backed out of his driveway, engines rumbling. But something told him this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the last SUV disappeared down the road, Tom closed the door, his pulse still hammering. He turned to Shadow. The dog sat there, quiet, waiting. Tom exhaled, running a hand through his hair. What the hell did I just get myself into? Shadow didn't answer, but somehow, Tom already knew. He was in deeper than he ever could have imagined. And this was just the beginning. The truth came out in pieces. Shadow wasn't just a military dog. He was something else entirely. A top-tier K-9, trained for high-risk operations, the kind that never made it into the news. His handlers hadn't just taught him obedience and discipline. They drilled him in survival, tracking, combat tactics. He had been more than just a companion to soldiers. He had been their shield, their lifeline. And then, it had all gone wrong. The officer stood stiffly in Tom's living room, his boots planted firmly against the wooden floor. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded a lot like guilt. Shadow was part of an elite unit. He worked alongside the best of the best, the officer said, gaze flicking toward the dog. He was trained for missions most people wouldn't survive. Tom swallowed. He looked down at Shadow, who sat beside him, perfectly still, watching, always watching. The officer continued. Last deployment was overseas. We had intel on a high-value target, a capture mission. It should have been straightforward. He paused, shaking his head, but nothing ever is. Tom leaned forward, every muscle tense. What happened? The officer exhaled. The mission was ambushed. A setup. The team made it to the extraction point, but he hesitated. Then, the chopper was shot down. Tom felt his stomach drop. The words carried a weight, the kind that didn't need dramatics to make an impact. A chopper crash. Chaos. The kind of thing that ended lives before they even hit the ground. Shadow was with them. Tom asked quietly. The officer nodded. He was part of the team. When the wreckage was searched, There were no signs of survivors. He glanced at Shadow again. We assumed he was dead, but he hadn't been. Tom's throat tightened as he stared at the German shepherd beside him. He had survived, somehow, against all odds. Shadow had crawled out of the wreckage, wounded, alone, stranded in enemy territory. No backup, no handler, no team, just instinct. Tom tried to picture it. Shadow limping through the aftermath, the smoldering remains of the crash site behind him. Nothing ahead but miles and miles of unknown land. How far did he travel? Tom asked, his voice hoarse. The officer's jaw clenched. Hundreds of miles. Tom inhaled sharply. Shadow had navigated unfamiliar terrain, avoided threats, outrun danger. He had survived in a place where he wasn't supposed to. And somehow, through all of it, he had made it here, to Tom, a man he had never met, a stranger. And yet, it didn't feel like a coincidence. Tom glanced at the officer. And now you want him back? The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. He belongs to the military, Mr. Walker. The words were firm, absolute, but something in them made Tom's skin prickle. He wasn't stupid. He had seen how Shadow reacted to these men. Not with outright aggression, not with fear, but with something colder, more calculating. This wasn't just a story about a lost dog being reunited with his team. Something was off. Shadow didn't look at these men like they were his handlers. He looked at them like they were liars. Tom's mind was racing now. He knew what he should do. The logical choice. The one that would keep him out of trouble. Shadow was a military dog. He wasn't Tom's. But logic had nothing to do with what he felt in his chest. Shadow had chosen him. And somehow Tom knew. He couldn't just let him go. Not yet. Tom exhaled. Standing, he looked the officer square in the eye. He's not just an asset, he said. He's a survivor. He's been through hell and made it back. For the first time, the officer's cold, unyielding expression cracked. Just slightly. Just enough to show something human beneath it. I know, he admitted. And that's why he needs to come home. The words made sense. And yet they didn't. Because home wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a contract or a duty or a mission. Shadow had a choice now. And he had already made it. Tom's heart clenched. He knew the right thing to do. And yet, it felt like he was giving up a piece of his heart. He knelt beside Shadow, running a hand over his fur. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch. He just looked at him. Those deep brown eyes filled with something Tom didn't quite understand. A connection, one that had been forged not by time, but by something unspoken. Tom swallowed hard. You've got a whole team waiting for you, don't you, boy? Shadow let out a soft breath, a quiet sound, almost like he understood. Tom reached for the leash. His fingers hesitated before looping it around Shadow's collar. The moment he handed it over, something inside him twisted. Shadow didn't resist, didn't fight, but as the soldier led him away, as the team started moving toward the vehicles, something happened that Tom didn't expect. Shadow stopped, turned, looked back, and in that instant Tom knew. He hadn't just been a rescuer. He had been chosen. Shadow wasn't just a stray. He was a hero. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to go back. Tom's fists clenched. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he made his decision. One that would change everything. Wait! The word cut through the cold morning air like a blade. The soldiers halted. The officer turned. Tom took a step forward. I need the truth, he said. The officer's expression darkened. I told you the truth. No, Tom said, shaking his head. Not all of it, because there was something they weren't saying. Something Shadow knew. Something Tom could feel in his bones. And he wasn't letting go until he found out what it was. The convoy disappeared down the road, the rumble of engines fading into the distance. Tom stood on his porch, his hands resting on the railing, his mind strangely quiet. Shadow was gone. For the first time since that stormy night, the house felt empty. Not just physically, but in a way that settled deep in his chest. He glanced down at the empty dog bowl by the door. The blanket Shadow had curled up on last night was still there. A few stray hairs clinging to the fabric. Evidence that, for a brief moment, Shadow had been his. He should have felt good about doing the right thing. But then why did it feel like he'd lost something he wasn't supposed to lose? Tom exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Maybe he was just being sentimental. Maybe he was just exhausted. Maybe Shadow was never meant to stay. And yet, something gnawed at the back of his mind. That look, the way Shadow had stopped, turned back, hesitated. It hadn't been obedience. It hadn't been hesitation. It had been something else. Something Tom couldn't shake. The military had given him all the answers. Or at least, all the answers they wanted him to have. Shadow was a highly trained canine. He had survived impossible odds. He had belonged to a team before he had belonged to Tom. And yet, for some reason, when given the choice to go anywhere after escaping, he had ended up here. With him, it didn't make sense. Unless, Tom frowned, his gut twisting. Had Shadow been running from something? A sharp gust of wind rustled the trees, and Tom forced himself to step back inside. No use in standing around, thinking about a dog that wasn't his anymore. He should move on. Shit. But as he closed the door behind him, the silence of the house felt wrong. For the next few days, Tom tried to settle back into his routine. Work, fixing up the old truck, watching TV at night, but everything felt off. Every time he turned a corner, he half expected to see Shadow curled up on the rug. Every time he walked to the fridge, he hesitated, his mind instinctively drifting toward whether the dog needed food. Every time he sat on the porch, the silence was heavier. It was ridiculous. Shadow had been with him for barely 2 days, and yet it felt like something had been ripped out of his life. He told himself it was just habit, just the way the mind worked, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. And then, on the 4th night after Shadow left, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Tom frowned, swiping to open it. A single photo loaded on the screen. His breath caught. Shadow, sitting proudly beside a group of soldiers. He looked healthier, stronger, and happy, or at least, as happy as a military dog could look. Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And then, below the photo, there were 4 simple words. He still remembers you. Tom stared at the message, his heart tightening. He had been right. He hadn't imagined it. Shadow had hesitated, had looked back for a reason. Because to Shadow, Tom hadn't just been a random stop on his journey. He had been something more. Tom exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. He should be relieved, grateful, and yet there was an ache in his chest that wouldn't quite go away. Because sometimes you don't just rescue a dog. Sometimes they rescue you. And sometimes the hardest part of loving something is knowing when to let it go. The days turned into weeks, and slowly Tom adjusted. The empty feeling in the house dulled. The quiet became normal again. And yet every once in a while, out of habit, he'd catch himself glancing at the porch, at the driveway, as if expecting to see Shadow there, waiting. It was foolish, but some things just stick with you. Then, one evening, as he was closing up the shop, his phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, just a short video. Tom hesitated before opening it. The screen flickered to life, and there he was, Shadow. This time, running drills, fast, precise. But at the end of the course, just before the camera cut out, Shadow turned his head, just slightly, as if sensing something, as if searching for something that wasn't there. And in that moment, Tom knew. Shadow did remember, not just as a handler, not just as a mission, but as something more. Tom shut off his phone, staring at the night sky. He didn't know if he'd ever see Shadow again, didn't know if their paths would cross once more. But he did know one thing. Some bonds aren't meant to be broken. Some souls find each other, no matter the distance. And sometimes, even when you let go, you never really say goodbye. Tom smiled to himself, shaking his head, because in the end, he had thought he was rescuing a lost dog. But maybe, just maybe, Shadow had been rescuing him all along. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful animal rescue stories.